Hello, and we are set to begin. There's a steady flow of people coming in, so I'm just going to take a minute to welcome those of you who are here already. I am so excited. This is our first meeting of the season, and let's just give everyone another minute. And as usual, we will start with a minute of meditation or centering or whatever you want to call it, because we are the feminist and women's movement, and we do so much. And when we gather this way from around the world, from different times, different spaces, different events that we're all coming from, I believe it is important for us to center ourselves and acknowledge the shoulders we stand on, the future generation we're working for, and also all the hard work that we do. So as Devin, our amazing program manager, is letting people in, I'm going to ask you all to just take a moment. You don't have to close your eyes. You can do whatever you want. You can pray. You can just look at faces if you wish. But let's just take a minute, and as you're coming in, please introduce yourselves and let us know if this is the first time you're joining us. I'm very curious because we used to do this when we were in person, but I always like to know who's new in the room. So Devin, if you don't mind, I'm going to put a minute on my clock, and I want everyone to just think and energize yourself and center yourself with us. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you for indulging me and my team with this 1 minute of centering and connecting. Thank you so much for being here. I still see a few people coming in, but it is 8:35 and I would like to start and honor everyone that has been on time. So welcome to NGO CSW 66th season. So this is our kicking off monthly meeting for CSW 66 forum that we're going to be preparing for. I see a lot of familiar faces. Thank you for being here. My name is Huri Gedelekian. I am the chair of NGO CSW New York. I'm the proud chair of NGO CSW New York. Thank you for allowing me to stay on for another 2 years. We had an election in June. We, of course, we did not stop over the summer. We have been meeting, brainstorming, gathering. I actually want to share, I am so proud of my team. I'm going to share a link. That is our executive committee. If you have not had the chance to go on our website, meet them, they are all here. And if you want to wave, all the executive committee members, thank you all so much for being part of this team. You guys are the wind beneath my wings. And we are kicking off an amazing season with some great plans already. So the first big announcement I want to make, you all have to put up with me this month. I'm going to be the one making most of the announcements going forward. I will make room for our co-chairs who I'm about to announce, our forum co-chairs. And then also I will have a space for generation equality updates going forward, but I'll tell you all about that as I make, all this stuff that you'd all need to know about. Okay, so you also, our new executive committee, I'll put it in again for those of you, I still see so many people joining. That's wonderful. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So the first big announcement is that, as you know, Ivy Cook and myself were the co-chairs of the forum last year that we pulled off our first ever complete virtual forum. And I think it was a pretty good success. I hope you all think it was a pretty good success. This year, I am so proud and honored to introduce Rosa Lizardi and Pamela Morgan. And if Rosa and Pamela just say hi quickly. Yes. Hi, Pamela.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Amazing women. So going forward, you will hear from them updates from the forum, but I'll give you an overall vision of what it is that the executive committee and our new co-chairs have decided. Considering what the world is still going through, as you might have read it in our newsletter, we are still definitely going 100% virtual for CSW 66 forum. I do understand that with the global north being vaccinated and this Delta variant, I mean, I don't have to tell you, everybody is listening to the news and reading the papers and realizing that maybe things are going to get better. And maybe they will by December or January, maybe UN will be completely open. But right now, based on the knowledge that we have and where we are, and especially, and this is really important, that we are going to be dealing with the climate crisis. I and my team, NGO CSW Executive Committee, decided that the responsible thing, the right thing to do for the global feminist women's movement is stay 100% virtual. This is to consider carbon footprint, consider our global South sisters who might not be able to join us as much as we'd like them to, either for financial purposes or COVID or whatever the reason is, to really balance out the table, if you allow me to use that term. We think that it is really important to give space to everyone on equal terms. So yes, we are going 100% virtual. We are also very inspired by the reaction that we saw last year. We were expecting about 10,000 advocates. We went up to 27,000 on a 25,000 platform. So the platform was limited to 25,000 and we ended up hosting up to 27,000 active participants, 700 parallel events. You all know this because Devin, our program manager, created this amazing, and if Devin, if you have a chance, please share that again in our chat. You know, the results of the forum. So you will see this document that is so amazing. So we will then update you in the next couple of weeks. We will start sending out emails letting you know when the platform will open, and I'm actually happy to say that we're using the same portal. So if you were part of our forum last year, you've gotten used to maneuvering on Pathable. So we're using the same portal, and we're now trying to figure out how much to expand it. We're definitely paying a lot more to allow for a lot more people to join us, because the whole idea of NGO CSW is to allow space, access to anyone whose voice is not being heard at the UN. We all know that UN is specific for ECOSOC accredited organizations. We all know that the UN NGO committee more and more is limiting progressive activists, advocates, and organizations. And it is hard for your voices to be heard at the UN sometimes. And this is why I love what I do and why I'm proud to be part of NGO CSW. Our mandate is to make sure all of your voices are heard. So having said that, I take that responsibility, and my committee, my executive committee, we take that responsibility very seriously. So our goal is to make sure anyone who has a story or an advocacy or a project that wants to share, learn from each other, we want to provide that space for you. Having said that, we also are very careful to allow space to those who are pro-human rights and want to really work with us to improve this world and not take steps backwards, right? And we know that even progressive countries, just like the one I'm in the United States, we are always at risk of, bringing our achievements backwards. So we have to be careful about that because we want to improve and we don't want to take a step back. So thanks, Devin, for sharing. And let's see, what else can I tell you? Okay, so the couple of things I wanted to say, just because you're here now and these announcements will go out in emails, and I always like to give like a little advance. We are going to, as I said, use the same portal, keep almost everything similar. There will be parallel events. I know that is one of your favorite things to do at the forum, and we want to provide as much space for parallel events as possible. As I said, because we are paying a little bit more for our portal, and we don't, as of right now, we really don't have a huge fundraising that we're doing. We count on organizations who probably have a little bit more money and can afford to give us donations. We are going to definitely up the donation ask a little bit this year, especially because we are so proud to celebrate our 50th anniversary. And I see Rosa has done an amazing thing. Her background is our 50th anniversary. I'm jealous and I want to do it as soon as I get a chance. I love that logo that Deb created. Started maybe with that announcement. It is our 50th anniversary. You will see that all over our website and in our emails. So our goal is to really create an NGO CSW that is sustainable and can provide the space, as I mentioned, that we provide every year on an ongoing basis. To do that, we need to figure out ways that we can raise the funds that we need to keep this organization going. As you know, 90% of our, or even more, 95% of our constituents are volunteers. Our executive committee are mostly volunteers. We have one program manager who does the job of 3 people, to tell you the truth. And we have a couple of part-time employees. And as of 2 years ago, we do pay our interns, which I'm very proud of. So just to cover those costs, anything we do throughout the year, we have to figure out a way to make money. This is just for people who are new and have not experienced NGO CSW. When we met in person, we did this with our consultation day, with our meeting rooms, with whatever we could do, reception, sometimes made us a little bit money. And this is just for transparency. That's how we survive, right? So this year, we are going to have the parallel events. I'll go back to that and say that we are going to charge 125 instead of 100. And I hope that is not going to be a hardship for anybody. If anybody does have issues, as usual, they always reach out to us anyway, and we find a way to help them out. Let's see. I think I am going to stop here and see if there are any questions. We do have about 10 minutes before I hand over the mic to the 2 executive committee members who organized this monthly meeting, which I am so excited to be an audience for. I will introduce Rosa and Margarita in a minute to tell us their thoughts behind the panel discussion. So as I said, we, as you know, wrapped up our involvement, as I wait if there's any questions, of course. We wrapped up our responsibilities with the Generation Equality Forums. That was our role, is to help create and support the forums. When both of the forums happened, both Mexico and Paris, our role ended. So we took a step back, but that doesn't mean that we're not here to support and amplify action coalitions. We're not directly involved with action coalitions. We have members in our executive committee and even in our constituents who are part of action coalitions. And I really do encourage all of you to keep updated. We will update you, like I said, on a monthly basis. We will send in our monthly newsletters on the bottom. There will be a special section that will tell you all about what's happening with action coalitions. And the reason I like to support it, and I want you all to pay attention to it, is because we know why Generation Equality was created. It was because we were not getting the results that we wanted from CSW. Now, CSW, like I said, is our mandate. We are here to support it and make sure that we influence it with advocacy, and our advocacy and research committee is amazing this year. They've been working throughout the summer to actually do research so that we can have an influence and strong recommendations to the zero draft. We are also working behind the scenes because this year is the working methods of CSW. We want to see if we can influence change there. It is important that CSW works as is, right? And we want to improve that because all the hard work that the global women's and feminist movement puts in, we sometimes take one step forward and two steps back, even with the outcome document, as you all know. So the goal is to really make sure that we advance and we don't roll back, as I said before. So we're working with a team of experts, UN Women and member states as much as possible to influence them to improve the working methods so that CSW does work. In the meantime, I'm very excited, and I'll go back to saying why I'm supporting action coalitions. It's a new way of doing something to see if it can work better. So I want it to succeed. We should support it. We all should ask for action coalitions to succeed so we can learn from it and bring it into the CSW methodology, the multi-stakeholder approach, or the civil society driven approach. Because right now, CSW is not civil society driven, I hate to tell you. We're here to influence it. We're here to make a difference for it. And we, as I said, take our role very seriously, our mandate very seriously. We want to bring your voices into CSW, into member states, and influence them. Unfortunately, as hard as we work, and I'm telling you, we do work hard on this, and you know, and I know so many of you, I see your faces, you do it on your own as well, not just in our committees. We're not influencing them as strongly as we would like to. So in some ways, you can think of it as parallel advocacy with action coalitions and CSW, but why not? Let's just push it in every way we can to see how we can move forward, learn from each other, and improve it in whatever way we can. And I'm sure some of you also follow the SDGs. It's similar over there as well, right? I mean, gender equality is also part of SDGs, but SDG as a whole is not meeting the commitments and the promises that they're making. Now, of course, some of us can sometimes throw our hands up in the air and say, why are we doing this? What the heck is this for? I always go back to saying, UN is still the only space that gathers global leaders and activists. And it might be broken, but it is still the only place. And we want to make sure that we use it to the best of our abilities and what it can produce, and try to help improve it. I'm sure all of you work in large institutions, academic, corporate, or nonprofits, and the larger, the more crazy and combobulated these organizations can be, but we don't give up on it. We get up every morning and we try to improve it, and that's what our goal is here. So I don't see any hands up, and I hope my blabber made sense. I followed all the notes that I had and what I wanted to share with you all. And as I said, in a couple of weeks, you will start receiving emails launching our portal, letting you know about parallel events applications. It will open in mid-October and it will go into mid-December, I believe. I'm not like off the top of my head. I'm not going to give you the dates right now. We're just finalizing it as we sign our contract. So I am going to take a little break and have everybody catch their thoughts. I see everybody feverishly taking notes as well. We will have minutes and recordings shared with you. And let's just bring our organizers, monthly meeting organizers, and give them a few extra minutes to talk about themselves and their program. And then we can kick off the panel discussion even a few minutes early if your speakers are here. Thank you all for listening to me. If you have any questions, I'm going to be paying attention to the chat and interacting with you. Otherwise, I'm turning off my camera so you can concentrate on the speakers. I do advise you all to keep yourselves muted and then put the speaker view on so that you can engage with the speakers more directly. And again, I can't thank you enough for your support of NGO-CSW New York and our global sisterhood. And I can't wait to engage with all of you going forward throughout the year and CSW, and keep your eyes peeled on those emails that are coming from our office and stay engaged. Thank you all for being here. Rosa and Margarita, the floor is yours. Thanks, Devin, for the support too.
Thank you, Huri, and thank you, Devin, and the support team behind this. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Rosa Lizardi, and I am one of the co-organizers of this monthly meeting. And let me just hand over to Margarita to say hello.
All right, I'm unmuted. Hello, everyone as well. I'm really, really very proud to be part of this team and have been part of NGO-CSW for several years. And greetings to everyone. I mean, what women can do, let's go and move. I know we all have had some disappointments this last 1.5 years. So let's move on and do what we can. Thank you all.
Thank you, Margarita. And I just want to say, I mean, I don't want to say too much about me. You can look at the link and read my bio, but I just want to say on the issue of being a co-chair for the forum, I'm thrilled. I think I can speak for my co-chair, Pamela Morgan, that as two women of color heading this and leading this process, we're thrilled to be there, and we want to be in touch with you. We're going to be heading the Global Planning Committee, and we're on our way. So I welcome you to this monthly meeting. We have a fantastic panel, and I know that you want to hear from them, so do I. So let me just give a little context, and then we could move forward with the panel. So and Hudi mentioned this ahead of the CSW 66 with the priority themes of climate change, the environment, and disaster risk reduction, and with the sub-theme as women's economic justice. We thought we need to focus the first meeting on climate change. And what we're doing is we're looking at an intersectional approach. Climate change has been exacerbated by COVID. COVID has been delaying the work that needs to go into climate change. And within that also is this emerging issue of an increasing debt. So we combine the three because we know that these three issues are concocting a global toxic cocktail, which can produce triple effect and is producing triple effects, particularly impacting the lives of women and girls. So looking at this trifecta of issues, we've assembled a stellar panel. I'm going to just go through what we will be doing, and then I will be introducing our first speaker. So our panel is comprised of activists and our UN women specialists. First, we have Mara Dolan, and I will go into length in their bios a little bit, but first we have Mara Dolan, who's a program and advocacy associate at the Women's Environment and Development Organization. Next, we have Lidi Nakpil, who is the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, among other coordinating tasks that she has, but she's our debt expert. Then we will have Ms. Victoria Diaz Garcia, who is a program specialist on advocacy, partnerships, and within the civil society division at UN Women. And then following, we will have Selina Sano, who's the head of programs at PACJA, which is the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And then Margarita will lead us through some Q&A for you all. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to remind you all to please continue to be on mute. We will spotlight the speakers, but if you would like to turn off your video, that might help without to get into any interruptions. This session is being recorded. So without further delay, let me introduce Mara. And Mara, if you can show yourselves. I know I saw you, turn on your video, and then we can spotlight you. As I said, Mara Dolan is with the Women's Environment and Development Organization. Hi, Mara. Thank you so much for joining.
Hi,
We're thrilled to have you. Mara is a youth feminist activist, environmentalist, and writer. She works on policy research, advocacy, and coalition building among feminists and climate justice movement. Her journalistic work has been featured in many publications, including The Nation, Teen Vogue, Foreign Policy, and I guess I can say this, Bitch Media. Okay, so she hails from the unceded and ancestral lands of the Lenape people, now known as New York. So we're thrilled to have this youth activist. Mara, please, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. It's so good to be here. Thank you to NGO CSW and all the organizers. I'm really excited to share space with the really incredible panel. And I am honored to kick us off, but I will say I'm just going to try to lay some of the groundwork of some of the intersections between the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis, hopefully in a way that leads really nicely into the next panelist's contributions around debt and climate justice and more. So as Rosa said, I work with the Women's Environment Development Organization, or WEDO for short, which is a global feminist advocacy organization focused on gender, environment, and climate justice. And I think I just want to start out by saying, you know, the climate crisis is raging around us in increasingly violent ways. We know that its violence is compounded by the systemic violence of white supremacy and a global pandemic. we are seeing catastrophic wildfires and hurricanes and oil spills and droughts. And we are really witnessing the devastating effects of what is the accumulation of centuries of extraction and harm and exploitation and inequality, right, at the hands of colonialism and patriarchy and capitalism. And we also know that those who have contributed least to the global emissions that have caused the climate crisis are, of course, on the forefront of climate impacts. And this includes Black and Brown and Indigenous folks, folks from the global South, young people, women, queer folks, and folks who have contributed the most, wealthy nations, colonizing nations that have extracted and exploited, the corporations and the companies that have pursued planetary devastation over human rights. They are impacted the least while they have caused this crisis. So this is really what we're talking about when we talk about not just climate change or not just the climate crisis, but climate justice, right? Repairing and addressing those social inequities in how the climate crisis is actually experienced by folks. And climate justice is also about recognizing that feminist solutions, women-led solutions, and feminist and women-led resistance is showing us a future beyond the climate crisis, right? One where environmental defenders, many of whom are Indigenous women, are protected and safe from state-sanctioned violence. One where the right to healthy and clean water and air is a protected right for all. One where land sovereignty and food sovereignty are honored. So feminists are on the front lines of the climate crisis and are charting new futures where the systems of oppression that cause climate change are dismantled and are transformed into something new, a new world. So I often cite a quote from a journalist who I really admire, Mary Anais Hegler. I would encourage folks to look her up. And she writes about climate change and social justice. And I think about this quote most days. And she says, quote, "We live today in the age of crisis conglomeration. It's no longer useful or honest or even smart to look at any of them through a single lens," end quote. And I think, feminists are so used to working at the intersection of crises. And so feminist advocacy is really rooted in that first and foremost when it comes to the climate. There's no addressing gender inequities or racial inequities or class inequities or the climate crisis through a single lens, right? Their impacts intersect, and so the actions that we take to address them must as well. So this brings me back to the beginning of the pandemic, when feminist climate networks that we were a part of really came together in a moment of organized to outline key principles for what a just and resilient recovery from our current pandemic, as well as all of the crises that we know contributed to this moment, would look like. So I want to start actually with the recommendations and the principles of that website and that collective, because I want to build the connections to the climate crisis and the ways that these principles really stand not only as a key resource for us to think through in addressing the COVID-19 crisis, but also the climate crisis. So the principles are at feministcovidresponse.com, and folks should feel free to check them out there. It's also a resource repository and a tracker for many feminist observations and writings and arguments and research around the ways that gender and the COVID pandemic played out around the world and are continuing to play out. And I think the underlying foundation that website and that collective and these principles were built from was really an understanding that this global pandemic is not, just like the climate crisis, a great equalizer, but actually as a great exacerbator, right? Similar to how climate change magnifies and amplifies and compounds inequalities that already existed, it's actually challenging us to create deep and urgent and systemic change. And it's showing the fault lines in how our societies are organized and whose labor is essential, how resilient communities are able to provide social protection and care. It's really laying many of those things bare. So those are the starting points for deciding that we wanted to create these collective principles. And those principles are really, I think they're quite powerful. So I want to just actually read them out. And I'd love if folks, when they're thinking through these, think about the ways that they feel relevant to the COVID-19 pandemic response, and also undergird a response to the climate crisis. So these principles are that any COVID-19 response must center the well-being of all people in an intersectional manner. It must ensure the health and safety of all, including ensuring sexual and reproductive health and rights. It must promote a comprehensive paradigm shift, relying on adequate and equitable financing. It must be based on and strengthen democratic values. It must promote a just and equitable transition for people and the planet. And it must be guided by cooperation, multilateralism, and global justice. So when I'm thinking about some of these fundamental shifts that our response to the COVID crisis are, and the fundamental shifts required for the climate crisis, I'm struck by the fact that their root causes are the same, right? White supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, these are the driving systems that have allowed some to profit off of the expense, at the expense of the few, and prevent at the many, and prevent all people on planet for being cared for and healthy and safe, right? And this is how we've seen the COVID-19 pandemic create the inequities that it has, as well as the climate crisis. So here I want to emphasize, we can recover with an eye towards actually ensuring that all people have healthcare, and workers are paid a living wage. We can reorient our economy away from fossil fuels and instead really towards fairly compensating care work, which is low carbon, sustainable, valuable work that our entire society depends on. We can rebuild by investing in communities and regions that have been economically marginalized and disinvested for centuries, instead of returning to the widening wealth inequality in an economy that favors the rich and produced these crises, right? So here I think that there are three core pieces around our climate justice advocacy that really illuminate also some pieces of the COVID-19 pandemic response that I hope folks find valuable. So some of the things that we do and within our broader movements are really advocating to sort of center our response around in addressing the climate crisis and COVID crisis in tandem have been, first, heeding grassroots feminist and Black and Indigenous leadership. As I've said, climate change are plentiful, they are community-centered, they are justice-oriented, they exist everywhere. Don't let anyone tell you that we don't have the things that we need to solve the climate crisis. We do. From mutual aid networks to agroecology practices, to collective resource sharing, folks on the front lines of the climate crisis have always been at the forefront of solutions. So feminist climate advocacy here means really standing in total solidarity with water protectors, with land protectors, with folks who are pushing forward climate solutions, and saying that there are no sacrifice zones, and we all have a right to a healthy planet, right? The second piece in addressing the climate crisis and COVID crisis in tandem really revolves around this idea that care work is climate work. So we need to see new systems of valuing and supporting care infrastructure, right? We need to see the strong bridges being built between climate investment and climate action and care work. We know that care work is performed mostly by women and mostly by women of color. We know that it's life-sustaining work, it's life-giving work, and it's also work that is really central to the world that we need to transition to in order to actually address the climate crisis, right? It is low-carbon work. It is work that protects the health and well-being of people. It is not reliant on extraction. It's aimed at providing dignified and healthy lives for all. So care jobs are green jobs and climate jobs, and we need to be valuing that work as a part of both climate justice and gender justice. And then third, where we'd like to see really strong action around climate is put money where it matters, right? And I know that panelists after me are going to speak really in depth to debt and some of these broader economic pieces, but I think it's really important here to say that we need to be financing transformation, right? Now more than ever. We need to shift away from the dominant economic model that has us deeply invested in fossil fuels, in the military industrial complex, in all of these institutions built on extraction that are propagating the climate crisis, and really instead demand that, polluters pay, that climate finance is funded, and that climate reparations are paid. So our feminist climate justice advocacy that I think also ties so deeply into the COVID-19 response, and what we really want to see includes these three things: heeding frontline leadership, centering care in climate action, and really financing transformation. So here you might be thinking, if these are the three pillars that we need to think about in addressing the interlocking climate and COVID crisis, where is our roadmap? Where is our blueprint? And there are many, and there are really incredible agendas being pushed forward by feminists all over the world. And I can only point to one that I hope folks might take some time to read through. And Rosa also was part of driving this really incredible piece. I'm dropping the link in the chat, but this is a feminist economic agenda for people and planet, a blueprint that was put together by several feminist organizations who are part of the Generation Equality Forum Action Coalition leadership on climate and economic justice, and really thinking about the kinds of systemic transformations and paradigm shifts necessary to create an economic agenda that really works for people and planet and addresses both the COVID crisis and the climate crisis. So I will ask, I am running out of time and I want to be respectful of not going over my 10 minutes, but I would encourage folks to check out that resource and know that, you know, the magnitude of the interlocking crises in these moments of climate and COVID is necessitating a response that at the scale that both science and justice demand. And we can turn to these principles to really guide our advocacy and our resistance and our world building and our imagination of what might lie on the other side of recovery when we're building a world built on climate justice. So I'll end there. Thanks, Rosa. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Mara. We so appreciate you kicking off this discussion, because I think you very well laid the groundwork about how our approach should be looking at climate change, climate justice, as you said. I love what you said about the crisis conglomeration, and I know there was a question in the chat, if you can put the writer that you quoted. And thank you also for the hopeful message about how we could tackle climate change and the interlinked with COVID and with issues such as debt, and for highlighting those three core pieces: frontline leadership, care work as climate work, and financing transformation. And really highlighting the fact that we need to do that core work on systemic change and producing fundamental shifts. And I think that this is a great way of really helping us begin to look and prepare for this there was so much that you presented, and I'm glad that you put the link in there for you know, the feminist agenda for people on the planet. We, with the Feminist Task Force and the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development, we're collaborators as being on the economic justice and rights, but also Selena Sano, who's our fourth speaker with PACJA, also contributed and helped in this process. So thank you so much for that. If there are any questions in the chat, or if anyone has any questions for Mara, please put them in the chat, and Mara is going to try to answer them in the chat as well. But we will have a Q&A afterwards. So thank you so much, Mara. Let's move on to Lidi Naktil, and if we can pin Lidi. Thank you so much, Lidi, for being here. We so appreciate you taking the time. I think Lidi is another activist who also takes this intersectional approach to her work. Lidi is a global activist working on the issues of economic, environmental, social, and gender justice. Hello, Lidi. Nice to see you, longtime friend and colleague. Thank you for joining us. very late in the Philippines.
Very honored.
So Lidi's activism reaches national, regional, and global advocacy, primarily through successful campaigning on climate justice and debt justice. She is the co-coordinator of the Global Campaign on Debt Climate Justice and a member of the Global Coordinating Committee of the Global Alliance on Tax Justice, another issue which is interlinked, which I'm sure you're going to be telling us about. So we're thrilled. Lidi, please illuminate us on these interlinkages with debt, climate, and COVID.
Yeah, well, a good evening to everyone from Manila. It's about past 9 o'clock here, or about 12 hours ahead of the New York time. I'd like to ask for your indulgence for me to use some slides, mainly to guide me what I was going to say, not very colorful ones, but is that okay if I share the screen?
Yes. Let's
Yes.
see.
Okay.
We'll have, yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Oops, sorry, that's for another talk. Let me just do that, a change in the screen, sorry. Okay. We've been dealing with the multiple crises. Actually, it's not just the three, although the three crises is what we're focusing on tonight. It's the COVID-19 health pandemic and its economic fallout on top of already deep economic problems that people in the global south and of course many people also in the north are facing. The intensifying climate change and rising violence and repression and shrinking democratic space on top of that all. But for this session, I will focus more on the links between climate crisis and the problem of debt. But on the debt, I'd just like to give a little bit of history or maybe recall for us a little bit of history, how this problem came about, because that also in there lies the solutions. Loans have been pushed to the south by international and northern creditors for so many decades. And of course, heavy borrowing is pursued by southern elites and governments with a justification that our economies need capital infusion for development and to address poverty. But as debts of the South grew from the 70s to today, more loans were offered, leading to the massive ballooning of public debts for many countries of the global South, and thus the vicious cycle of borrowing to repay loans and the deprioritization of spending for public services started. Lenders or creditors have a big share in the responsibility for the debt problem, but we're also not absolving our southern governments because they share part of the responsibility. They helped perpetuate the myth that heavy borrowing is necessary. They would rather take this course, this easy course to keep on borrowing, than address structural and policy roots why public funds are always not enough, why our economies are bleeding, and why the majority of our people are poor. The impacts of huge debt payments of people's lives, especially on women, and our rights to essential services, health, education, housing, water, and others are the most visible aspects of this problem. But this problem goes way beyond these visible impacts. Various leverages and mechanisms were used by lenders not only to make sure that the debt payments would be top priority, but also to reshape southern economies. So this includes using access to credit and or debt relief schemes that we've run through so many of them since the 90s. These have been used to impose austerity policies, privatization, deregulation, and liberalization, supposedly to nurse back southern economies towards macroeconomic stability and put them on track for economic growth. But these policies not only resulted in deeper and more widespread poverty and further reinforced the net outflow of resources and wealth from the south to the north. The debt as it links to climate change, one of the issues here is that the debt has rendered peoples, communities, and women of the South even much more vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. Debt payments and the austerity and other policies that have been imposed or promoted using access to credit, debt relief, and so on, first left a legacy of highly inadequate public services that are desperately needed to enable our people and communities to deal with climate impacts. It also undermined our government's ability to implement necessary climate emergency response measures and programs for adaptation and building resilience. It also resulted in deeper and more widespread poverty and precariousness of life that magnifies the loss, the dislocation, and the damage sustained by impoverished and marginalized peoples and communities from climate impacts. Debt and lending has also been an obstacle for pursuing climate solutions. The debt and pushing of loans by creditors diminish Southern economies' ability to pursue these solutions. For instance, transformation of energy systems from fossils to renewable energy must be driven and supported by government policy and programs and public funds. But with debt payment burdens and the pressure to prioritize debt payments, our governments claim that public funds are so inadequate to finance the shift, let alone to ensure a just transition. The delivery of climate finance, which is an obligation of wealthy nations to countries of the South to finance climate actions, is not only highly inadequate, but a large bulk of it is in the form of loans. Not only do these climate loans add to the debt burdens, these are ineffective financial instruments for climate action. Loans have been and are being used to push and finance projects which exacerbate climate change. So this is another link. So for instance, a big proportion of loans to Southern governments from both public and private creditors are for financing of fossil fuel energy projects. To this day, when it is firmly established and widely acknowledged that up to 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from fossil fuel energy systems, much more loans are flowing for fossil fuels than grants and loans combined for renewable and clean energy transitions. We are all witness that already devastating and dramatic impacts of the climate crisis. So Mara actually made a list of so many of these impacts, so many of these effects. One of the lesser discussed impacts of climate is in exacerbating debt burdens. The climate crisis, as with what's happening, COVID-19 crisis, is used as justification for pushing more loans and resorting to more borrowings. So we have a study that since the COVID-19 crisis, there has been at least a 30 to 40% of increase in debt, outstanding debts of countries of the South, because the fiscal response to the COVID, it is more lending. And that is what is happening to the climate crisis as well. The climate crisis is also pushing up the cost of loans through higher interest rates for countries deemed more vulnerable to climate risks. So climate risks is now one of the factors for calculating what must be the interest rates imposed to new lending. The climate emergency. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 6th Assessment Report, Part 1, because there are many parts, was released last month and warns us that global temperature rise is already at 1.09 degrees Celsius, and profound life-changing impacts are coming much faster and stronger than they earlierly predicted. And we are now in a most critical decade. Immediate and near-term actions, which is what is needed within the decade, will determine whether keeping temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius and preventing extremely catastrophic climate change, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement, will still remain within reach. So what we do within this decade will determine if we can still achieve that goal. Proclamations of zero targets for 2050 are useless unless accompanied by corresponding immediate and near-term action. So we're actually now racing against time. One of the greatest injustice in the climate crisis, and Mara has also made that point, is that people of the South and people across the world who are indigenous peoples, poor, marginalized, women, those who have contributed the least to the problem bear its greatest impacts. And we say the same thing about the debt crisis. Those who have the biggest share of responsibility for these problems, who generated and accumulated wealth in the process, have the greatest obligation to address these problems. And yet, what we see are inadequate actions and false solutions for both crises. So at this point, I thought that I'm not going to share the rest of the slides, which is more about solutions because of the time constraints. But I just like to just point out that just and lasting solutions to the debt problem has been very clear for us for a long time. So debt cancellation, strategic structural reforms in economies, and global systemic changes. So are solutions to climate change. These are very clear based on science, fair shares, and justice. And Mara has already elaborated on some of them. And I would like to reinforce her message that what we need for both crisis of the climate and crisis of debt is systems change. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lidi. That was really also very packed with information. I thank you so much because you are really kind of lighting a fire under, I think, every one of us listening today, really making the alert and bringing this information that there's so much underlying the intersections with climate change and COVID, and the information about the 1.09 degrees Celsius already, impacting our world. We're seeing it, we're living it. It really calls for urgent system change. So if anyone is tweeting out there, please do the hashtag feminists want systems change, which is a vibrant hashtag that we've been using. I think that there was also the issue of austerity that you brought to us, the deprioritization of the public services, which I think is another area that we really do need to focus on. I know that you may be leaving us early to present at the UNCTAD meeting, which is happening concurrent with this one. I did see a question, so let me just follow up with the question for you. I did see a question from Maureen Umekiwulu from Nigeria. What's the role of women in curtailing the unwarranted loans, especially in developing countries? Let me just put that to you right now. And what about the call for debt relief for climate change initiatives? I'll just leave those two for you to respond, because I know you might not be available afterwards. Thank you.
We have a role in all system change efforts, including one of the most immediate, I think, fights that we need to make, which is preventing loans as the solution or even more debt as the solution in response to COVID, in response to climate, in response to many other issues that people are facing everywhere. So I think we as women, as women's movement should do, and I guess we're kind of used to that as women, no, doing all the work in all the spheres of life. We have to act on these issues and in every front. And we are currently part of an effort to reject loans and more debts as responses to this multiple crisis. So we do need to say that. There's a lot of things being said about debt cancellation. We need to reinforce those messages, but we should also refuse more loans. We should not only call for debt cancellation, but to also refuse more loans. The second question again, Rosa, I'm sorry. Did I actually cover it already? Campaigning. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Oh.
My apologies. Yeah, I think that to go back in this zoo of chats here for that second question, let me work on that. But what about the call for debt relief for climate change initiatives?
Oh, yes. Well, first of all, we'd like to say that the call for debt relief should actually be the call for debt cancellation. I mean, debt relief, the debt relief word or concept has been used to cover many things that aren't actually solutions to the debt problems. No, for instance, what we're getting from the G20 or the IMF, the debt service suspension initiative, and now the debt common framework, which is from the G20. They're not immediate nor lasting solutions to the debt. So we really need to call for outright debt cancellation. And debt cancellation will mean a lot of funds freed up for very urgent needs. And one of that is for climate actions. So yes, one of the things we're calling for is debt justice, debt cancellation for climate, but also for COVID and for many other things. But we need to remind governments that the climate crisis is one of the very urgent, life-threatening reasons why we urgently need debt cancellation. And there is an ongoing campaign. We'd invite you to join us. There's regular meetings every 2 weeks of groups who are interested in addressing both debt and climate. And I think we can share the information with everyone through Rosa about these meetings.
That was the last question I was going to tell you, because I know that there's a lot of campaigning right now, and October is a very important month on campaigning on debt and climate change. And I see a message in the chat from our colleague Yolanda Fresnillo of your dad around the global call for debt audits. But I was so with information about the campaigns in October, which is why we had this meeting now, because we wanted to get ahead of those campaigns and ahead of the COP organizing. So please, if you want to get involved, check the chats, and we will send out to those who came today information about how to get involved. So Lidi, thank you so much. Good luck on your UNCTAD presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Sorry for leaving you too soon.
Thank you so much. That's no problem. So we will move on to our next speaker. I think we have Victoria Diaz Garcia. If you can turn on your video, Victoria, and then we can spotlight you.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Victoria Diaz Garcia is in the Women's Civil Society Division since the early 2019. Where she's been leading research on civil society and supporting advocacy, partnerships, strategic planning, program and policy initiatives. She also authored the booklet on women and impacts of COVID-19, which she's going to share findings with us. So we are thrilled to have you. She's been with UN Women since early 2011, having worked in Latin America and the Caribbean and also in West Africa. And she holds a PhD in international politics and development from Dublin City University, where she did research on national women's machineries, including the nature of their relationship with women's rights movements. So I think we both have UN Women and an inner activist as well presenting with us today. So thank you, Victoria. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rosa, so much. And I am delighted to be here. I want to congratulate NGO-CSW for the 50th anniversary. Also congratulate you all for that amazingly successful effort of expanding the outreach during these difficult times of the COVID pandemic and reaching out to so many more activists, using digital tools. So thank you also, Daven. I think she's going to pass the slides for me. I'm actually very happy to be here, and I hope these key findings that I would like to share with you all today, key findings, but also some policy recommendations from the research that we conducted at UN Women on how women's rights organizations are being impacted by the COVID pandemic. I hope you find them useful to inform the action points that you wish to put forward for the upcoming CSW session on climate change and or climate crisis and gender equality. But I also want to say that we find these findings relevant, not only for the priority theme of the upcoming session, but also very critical, relevant regarding the review theme of the upcoming session on women's economic empowerment in the changing world of work. And we also find that they speak very clearly also of the relevance of the priority theme of this year's CSW on women's leadership and participation in political life, political and public life. So I'll try to be brief, because there is a lot of information in the analysis we conducted and a lot of examples. If we can go to the next slide, I want to first focus a little bit on why obviously the civil society response to the pandemic matters, and by extension, to this crisis, but also to all other crises, and many of them have already been mentioned, including the gender inequity crisis. So, of course, we have seen that during the pandemic, a lot of attention has been paid to the disproportionate toll that the pandemic is having on women and girls, in particular to the livelihood security, the burdens of care, and this was already mentioned, the increased levels of violence. We have also seen a lot of attention being paid to the adequacy of government-led responses to mitigate these effects. And these are obviously very important aspects. But we found, and we see clearly, that there is a third aspect that has remained more invisible, and this has to do with the community responses to the pandemic, what we call the shadow response. And as we all know, and as it is all too often the case when we face different crises, including natural disasters, humanitarian emergencies, and so on, the responses from communities are very varied and can range from grassroots self-help groups, mutual aid groups, to more formal NGOs, community organizing, transnational, global, and so on. And we know that a lot of these responses are often led by women. We also know that these community responses, civil society responses, are critically of significant importance, in particular for women's well-being on the ground, particularly for those living in low-income, vulnerable communities where state responses are not accessible or may not even exist. So I wanted to point that out, and if we can go to the next slide. I want to say very quickly just a few things about how women's rights organizations are responding to the COVID pandemic. And we have found in this piece of research and in other research we have done that obviously they have been playing three critical roles, interrelated roles that they usually play. They have been obviously at the forefront of the COVID-19 community response. So one of them is they've been playing a key frontline service provision role, often filling gaps in essential services. They have been distributing food, aid, PPE. They have been organizing collective childcare. They have been supporting survivors of violence and so on. We also see clearly that they are acting as advocates, strong advocates for gender-just policy responses, using different tools, adapting also to new modalities of work and advocacy, using petitions, campaigns, putting together proposals to influence governmental decisions and policies. And they have also been playing a key role as watchdogs. These organizations continue to demand accountability from state actors and other duty bearers, and they continue to mobilize against the violation of human rights. So you'll find plenty of examples from different countries in the policy brief. I'm not going to mention any in particular, but I just want to quickly rescue two key takeaways that we found. One is that obviously we see clearly that the past organizational capacity that these organizations have shapes the strength of the community responses. So women's rights organizations with a strong organizational capacity before the pandemic, and by extension any crisis, were able to scale up, adapt, and support more swiftly during the crisis. So this obviously justifies and shows the importance of supporting on an ongoing basis the organizational capacity building during so-called normal times, as this is instrumental to building resilience to future crises and to what they say or call building back better. So the second key takeaway is that obviously to achieve policy influence, and this has already been mentioned, it's very important to focus on the role of alliances and coalitions among feminists within and outside the state, and also alliances with other progressive forces at multiple levels. So this is how change can be effected. So if we can go to the next slide, I want to very quickly go through some of the key challenges that we identified that women's rights organizations are facing. Okay, here. So in terms of key challenges, we identified three critical areas of impact that the crisis has had on women's rights organizations. The first one has to do with the impact to civic space. This was, I think, already mentioned by one of the speakers. So this is critical, the impact to civic space of the COVID-related emergency measures, and how in some countries these measures have been used or misused to control, to suppress feminist activism, in particular in cases where women's rights are being contested, and where human rights defenders are targeted because of the work they do. So the rights to freedom of assembly and expression and the rights to privacy have not always been upheld, both on the streets or online. The second impact has to do with funding. Many of these organizations were already critically under-resourced before the pandemic, in particular in the Global South. With the COVID crisis, their budgets have been drastically reduced because of different reasons. One of the reasons is the channeling of national and international funding to the emergency response in some cases. Another reason is the drop in the financial contributions of NGO individual members. Another one is the cancellation of fundraising or income generating activities, which has been very difficult in these times of pandemic. And we know that the sudden drop in the finances of women's rights organizations has a domino effect, obviously, on the activities they can implement, including in conflict-affected and humanitarian settings. And the third challenge that we found has to do with the working conditions of women's rights organizations. We know that the labor force in the non-profit sector tends to rely on women and volunteers, and you know this very well in NGO-CSW. We know that this non-for-profit sector is also characterized by precarious conditions with high levels of job insecurity, low salaries sometimes, or limited or no social benefits, but also with this expectation that, you know, working hours are very long and people have to be available all the time. So obviously not everyone can engage, even you know, if they want to. And the pandemic has made these conditions worse by increasing hiring freezes in some cases, layoffs, by imposing salary reductions. So at the same time, we know that these organizations have had to increase their services. So they have had to do this at the same time as reducing budgets in many cases, and this has obviously forced them to rely even more on volunteers to compensate for these challenges and to maintain the services open. So let me go to the next slide very quickly. I'm mindful of time. I want to go through the recommendations that we identified, and again, without identifying any concrete examples. In terms of the recommendations, I think it is quite easy to see how all these challenges are intertwined, interrelated. So the policy brief proposes recommendations in 4 critical dimensions, and they must be addressed in a holistic manner, especially by governments, funders, donors, so that these civil society organizations can be supported in a sustainable manner and beyond these crises, including obviously as part of climate change and adaptation, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. So the first recommendation has to do with how imperative it is that women's rights organizations have a seat at the table. I think this was also mentioned by Mara. They need to be at the table where the measures and the policies are designed, implemented and monitored. We know that as community knowledge brokers, they must be engaged in a meaningful way to inform and shape decisions and actions, because we know that they bring the perspectives and the realities of the different women and girls that they serve and represent. The second recommendation has to do with recognizing women's rights organizations as essential service providers and improving their working conditions. This facilitates a number of different elements, including access to formal decision-making spaces, access to governmental subsidies and emergency funding, access to health and safety as well. But also, for example, in the context of COVID, this in some cases facilitated being exempted from mobility restrictions in the case of lockdowns. The third one has to do with sustaining and increasing the funding of women's rights organizations to support the adaptation and sustainability of their operations and advocacy work. And this includes the need to increase and improve access to both emergency and long-term funding, having flexibility in funding and administrative requirements, supporting the financing of core operational costs, including investment in technology and health and safety, and supporting more direct funding, in particular for small and medium-sized organizations in the Global South. So the policy brief also emphasizes very clearly the fundamental caveat that funding should always ensure and preserve the autonomy of these organizations to set their own agenda. And last but not least, it's obviously very important to safeguard civic space and protect women human rights defenders. The need for an enabling environment to support the work of the autonomous feminist and women's rights movements is obvious. The need to protect those who often risk their lives in the defense of human rights, and to ensure also that duty bearers uphold the rights to freedom of expression, assembly, and privacy, but also to ensure access to justice in the cases of violence and violations of human rights, both online and offline. So I think I'll leave it there. And the last page slide is basically just a link to the policy brief. It's available right now in English, Russian, and Arabic, and it will soon be available in French and Spanish. I invite you to have a look at it, but also I will share in the chat box the link to other policy briefs we have prepared in relation to the COVID pandemic and the care economy, for example, or violence against women and others, and also the link to the Feminist plan that Young Women just launched this week. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the exchange and comments.
Thank you, Victoria. That was a stellar presentation. I did put in the chat the link to this policy brief. I think it is so relevant for our work and illuminates so many different areas. And I love also the recommendations at the very end around civil space, around protecting human rights defenders, about enabling environment. I mean, I think all of this really highlights how we have to keep calling for system change and keeping women's rights at the forefront of not only the COVID response, but climate change and debt as well. So we are going to open for questions. We have about 25 minutes. There's a lot of chatter in the chat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to call on Devon's help, and I want to see if there are any questions. If you can go to the bottom of your Zoom frame on reactions, and there is a raise hand button. So let me just go to my gallery view and see who we have. So we have Dorothy Onoja Titilayo and Joanna Smith, as I see the first raised hands. So, you know, you can actually speak in video if you have a question. And I want to ask that everyone be very, very considerate. We're opening for questions, not announcements. If you have any announcements about events, please put them in the chat. People are looking at that. So if you can limit to 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, so that we can give our speakers time to answer. So Dorothy, if you can unmute, and if you want to show your video, thank you. Go ahead.
Hello.
Welcome. Hello, Dorothy.
Good day, all. I'm Dorothy Onoja from Nigeria. I'm the founder of the Doronal J Limited. So my question is, do we need to register anywhere before the women-led organization working with the rights of women at the grassroots? Do we need to register anywhere before our organizations are funded? Because we have been following this COVID-19 Gender Health Hub from the beginning for long. We have the grassroots with women.
Okay, great. Let me just pin that. And you know, I thought that Selena had dropped off, but Selena is here. So let me turn to our next speaker, and then we'll follow up with questions. We have Joanna and Catherine next, but I thought that Selena had dropped off, but I've been informed that she is here. So let me bring on Selena, and I think Selena brings also a very critical component, which is looking at the continent of Africa. So Selena, can you turn on your video and show yourself so we can pin you?
Yes.
Oh, there you are. Thank you.
No, I've been here all along, and I've listened to every single presentation. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. I thought you had dropped off because of the internet. So thank you so much for being here, Selena. Let me introduce Selena. Selena Sano, who is the head of programs at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, PACJA. And let me just highlight that her organization is also part of the Action Coalitions for Feminist Action on Climate Justice. She is a Pan-African policy and advocacy expert with many years of experience in strategic partnership development, research, and program work. She also is overseeing a program mirroring 3 thematic areas on resilient people, societies, and economies, just transition and energy and access and climate finance. So she brings a wealth of knowledge and we're thrilled to have her. Selena, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I will try to be as quick as possible because I see the time is also, time is also running out. Just for those online who do not know PACTURE, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance is a continental coalition of over 1,000 CSOs from 48 African countries. We were founded in 2008. We're headquartered in Nairobi, and we bring together, faith-based organizations, women movements. We work also with trusts, foundations, farmers, the youth, and all people that live at the front line of climate change. We also work with governments to drive African agenda at the international level, and in the continent we work very closely with institutions like the African Union, African Development Bank, and the United Economic Commission for Africa. I'm sorry, Rosa, I have some slides I can't share. They are not well organized because I'm still on the road. I just came from the Climate Change and Development in Africa, CCDA, in Cape Verde, where we were having a meeting to deliberate the messages that we want to bring to COP26. So just to highlight that what came out very strongly from CCDA 19 Cape Verde that we are bringing to COP26 is the fact that the international community promised at least $100 billion annually for climate finance, for doing climate work. And to date, that has not been fulfilled the way it should have been. And this is affecting, of course, the countries in the global south, especially women and girls in rural areas and the kind of work that they do. And in areas where this money has trickled in, we also found out that the rules and regulations are very stringent and does not allow people to access easily. And women and girls have difficulties in accessing this money because of their capacities, and they cannot even develop bankable statements that can allow them access this money. So there is a huge problem, and we're bringing back to that to Glasgow. We also discussed Africa, which is a region of special needs and circumstances. And I think Lydia had mentioned earlier on that this is the same case with everywhere in the global south. But Africa really has this very special needs because we never contributed or we never caused climate change. But we are one region today that is bearing the biggest brunt, and this is affecting also people at the grassroots, and especially women and girls for that. So today when I was asked to talk about the tribal crisis, I want to agree also with Lydie that it's not just a tribal crisis. There are several dimensions to this problem right now, and it goes beyond the tribal that we are talking about. We've seen also, as Lydie mentioned, also some of the issues like the swinging space, the women rights defenders, and I really want to mention, for instance, one white Kenyan woman from my country that was killed last month, a defender, an environmental defender. Her name is Joanna. She has been buried. Nobody has been arrested for that. So we also work with women, human rights defenders of climate justice and environmental issues. So I will start the presentation with an overview, mentioning that the poorest populations in Africa are struggling against yet unforeseeable consequences of the virus of COVID-19 and the impacts of climate change. Because climate change and the pandemic really are a twin problem. We have to develop a holistic approach of addressing the two. We cannot address them separately. They are very much related. Urgent support is needed in building resilience to the health and climate crisis and in dealing with the inevitable and increasing impacts of climate change. Lack of food and clean water, lack of access to health care, no reserves for emergencies disproportionately affects women, particularly indigenous women and women living in rural areas. Poverty makes women vulnerable both to the impacts of climate change and to the current health crisis caused by the novel coronavirus. Both factors can easily become existential threats to women in Africa. If you look at climate crisis and the pandemic, the interplay between these two crises is currently emulsifying into a toxic cocktail for affected populations. It is clear how brutally one crisis reinforces the other. They hit women, the poorest and the weakest hardest, acting as disaster multipliers and forcing people into extreme poverty. For African countries, these crises have been compounded by debt burdens, constraining governments' ability to respond. This phenomenon has heightened inequality and imperiled women's human rights due to the household burden of care work. And I just want to talk about the debt a little bit, just to give you some statistics to say that I think if there is a region that is really indebted is Africa. It's especially sub-Saharan Africa. Today, South Africa's external debt reached $188 billion in 2019. Looking further, Angola is the most indebted African country, as by the African Insider, with an estimated debt of $25 billion right now as we speak. We also have another problem around debt that has come in, and this is who owns the debt mostly that Africa has. Africa's largest bilateral creditor, China, holds at least 21% of Africa's debt, and payments to China account for nearly 30% of 2021's debt service, as shown in the figure, as the statistics show. So these are the problems that we're struggling with, and as Libby even said earlier on, we shouldn't be talking about debt cancellation. We should be talking about stop borrowing. My country in Kenya is borrowing a lot from China, and we don't know who is going to pay back this debt. And it is really a burden for the people, especially women and girls, that this is going to continue. We have to campaign for our governments to stop continuing to borrow this debt. Now, if you look at the climate crisis, COVID-19 and the debt crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic has come on top of the climate crisis. The new heights at the moment when debt levels were already historically high in this continent. This triple climate change, debt and COVID-19 crisis has catalyzed a situation where vulnerable nations are being squeezed between financial, economic, climate, and health risks. Neither can they afford huge investments in recovery programs, nor can they invest in resilience at the levels required to reduce their future risks. As a result, not only sovereign debt, but also climate-induced loss and damage will further rise, with women and vulnerable frontline communities paying the highest price. Now, if you look at IFIs and the triple crisis, some countries in Africa and the global south have been unable to access vaccines. We in Africa now are talking about another appetite, bigger than what we saw in South Africa. This is the vaccine appetite. The inability of these countries to access vaccines due to intellectual property protection for pharmaceutical corporations, privatization and vaccine nationalism has exposed and aggravated long evolving figures of the current economic models and structures, requiring a deep rethink of the practices and conditionalities of lenders, including the IMF and other IFIs, which have frequently contributed to these failures. So it is really a huge problem for us in the continent. Now I want to link then gender justice and the triple crisis. The debt crises are rooted in global inequalities and colonial legacies, as well as ongoing corporate captures of critical government decision-making institutions. Even in the midst of the pandemic, structural reforms have undermined food sovereignty, promoted regressive taxation, and imposed austerity on the majority, leading to impoverished dispossession and growing inequalities, including gender inequalities facing women who bear disproportionate burdens of care and are heavily represented in informal and precarious work sectors, along with many communities. So what is Structure doing currently? Very quickly, I'll just mention that, and then I'll return the conversation to Rosa. But what we are doing at Structure currently is, given this problem and looking at grassroots communities that are suffering from this, we are working to build the resilience of communities, especially women and girls, by linking communities or facilitating a relationship between communities and local private sector organizations to provide support in terms of livelihoods that would build the resilience of this community. So what we do, for example, if I give a good example, is we have created a relationship between communities with BIDCO. BIDCO is a company that provides sunflowers to women at the grassroots level. So they provide the seed, they support the women through the value chain, and most interestingly, they also provide the market to these communities. So it's one way of building the resilience of women at the grassroots level, for them to have at least livelihoods, especially right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, for them to be able to build viable livelihoods to support their families, and also to have in some cash coming in from this crop, when other things have failed, when climate change has made it very difficult for families also to reconstruct viable livelihoods. That is the much I can do for today, Rosa, and I'm still on the road, but that's the best I could have come up with. Thank you very much.
Selena, we are so thankful that you were able to join us from the road, because you really complete this panel. And thank you for highlighting these very special situations, special needs of Africa, which we have to continue to put our attention to. Particularly, you highlighted the historical indebtedness, which is much higher in Africa, and these levels are exacerbating, as you mentioned, poverty, inequality, gender inequality. You highlighted also very critical the vaccine inequity and the lack of access to the vaccine of COVID, to counter COVID. And this is an issue that is ongoing, which I think, as you mentioned, you don't only have a triple crisis, you have crises beyond that as well. The extractives that are taking place in Africa as well. And also, as you mentioned, the colonial legacy and the corporate capture. So these are all very, very critical points. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to the questions. I know that Dorothy's question was answered in the chat by Hootie. That's more of an administrative question. So I'm going to go on to Joanna Smith and then check to see if there are any other, we have Catherine as well who follows. So I ask, let's keep these questions to the speakers. If there are any administrative questions, put it in the chat and we will have Hootie or Devin reply to them. So Joanna.
Good
Please.
morning, all. Hi, I'm Joanna Altman Smith. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I'm so glad we got to hear from Selena before my question, because my question was about civil disobedience and the role it plays in what we're trying to achieve here. Selena mentioned the death of a climate activist in Kenya. I participate on the lowest level of New York City politics. I serve on my community board. I do a lot of letter writing and policy analysis like the rest of you, I'm sure. I vote, I go to protests. The IPCC report that came out recently has lit a fire under me. It's code red for humanity. I have been called to start using my body in nonviolent ways to achieve our policy goals. And I was curious to hear from this wonderful international group of successful nonviolent civil disobedience actions that they've seen in their homes, their home countries. I think we can all learn a lot from each other about how to move the dial in this urgent time. And I'm going to put a link to a documentary in the chat that I recommend for everyone looking to find their bravery around this.
All right, while our panelists gather their thoughts, I'm going to go to Catherine and ask you to present your question. And if there are any other questions, please raise your hand. Catherine?
Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be here this morning. My question is with regards to—
Can you introduce yourself, just your organization and where you're from?
Okay. I'm Tapohao Salo. I live in the United States. I'm the Vice President of Presence for Charity, a nonprofit organization where we support the underprivileged in areas of education, farming, and medical mission. My question today, I'm also the founder and CEO of Moisi Naturals. I'm a wellness coach and information technology consultant as well. My question this morning is working with women in the rural areas as we support them in farming and in the process of reducing emission, we have started teaching them how to plant moringa seeds and actually using them and having a value chain, working with some groups. We've been doing this for quite some time. The issue we have always had is there has not been funding. I am not blaming anyone for that. The thing is, I don't know how to go about that because my family and I have been the one funding this project and trying to make sure that we follow rules and regulations as far as climate change is concerned so that we can live a better life. But the rural women that are into this, that are on ground, how do they get the support? And how do we, the small NGOs, get the support to be able to carry on with what we are doing so that we don't step back, especially after the whole COVID thing and reduction of income due to COVID? What do we do? And how do we get more involved in what you're doing today? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Let me turn to Mara for a reply to Joanna's, and thank you, Joanna. I see that you have put in the nonviolent civil disobedience video, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, in the chat. Thank you so much. Why don't we go to Mara and then Selena and then Victoria, and I think Victoria also, if anyone wants to answer Catherine's as well, I think the one Catherine question is good for you as well, Victoria. So Mara. Do we have Mara on? All right, let us go to Selena and then Victoria.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to address I think Catherine's question regarding what you work with rural women. I don't like the word rural women living in rural areas. Okay. Yes, and we support them in all this kind of work. Yes, but the finances are quite an issue. I am not a strong proponent of let us go to the north and get this money. You know, the way you say, oh, $100 billion has not come through because the international community promised. If they do it, it's because they made a mistake, they caused these problems, and they need to pay for their mistakes. That is one thing. But on the other hand, I think in the finance meeting in Addis Ababa in 2015, we were told very clearly to go back home and do DRM. Go for domestic resource mobilization. We were told that our countries have the money, and truly speaking, they do have the money. Yeah, if I take a country like you come from Nigeria, I think I come from Kenya, the resources are huge. But where are these resources? We continue going out, taking money from the Chinese, taking money from the World Bank, and yet we have these resources because we cannot manage them very well. We've seen the debts. But there's another problem also. Illicit capital flows out of Africa is huge. Africa in itself loses about $88 billion annually to illicit capital flows. That makes 37% of our GDP from the continent. That's a lot of money that we could have used that money to support those women that you are working with in the rural areas. So I think there is also a problem with us and our governments. And what are we doing to ensure that the government actually does proper DRM and uses the money in proper programs that support women and girls in rural areas? It is our role. I think we need to push and campaign and do everything we can to make sure that our governments are doing the right thing. Our governments are coming through for the people. Because these people make up a lot and they contribute a lot to our GDPs at national level if they had the support that they needed. Let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Selena. And we have apologies for Mara that she has had to go to another meeting. So I am just going to put in the chat again the link for the Blueprint for a Feminist Agenda for People on the Planet, which really illuminates a lot of the points that she presented. And I think the one of civil disobedience, I know that Mara is involved in the young feminist activists for climate justice, which is a space where there is sometimes civil disobedience and certainly activism. So let's bring in Victoria for a reply. And I also want to highlight a question I saw in the chat. I think that people in the chat, you see that they are saying, as Selena was presenting, similar situations in Asia and Bangladesh. I saw a comment from, I believe it was Sheila Dallas Katzman. Thank you for highlighting debt cancellation. This is a sore that is oozing across the global South, particularly in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. China is at the forefront, leading the US over the last 20 years. How can civil society bring pressure to bear on individual governments to stem the overbearing loans that give rise to poverty in societies of developing nations? So, Victoria, thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. And I love the question about civil disobedience. So I don't think I can share any concrete examples, but obviously the force is in coming together. So obviously one of the strategies is building alliances, coming together, joining forces. And if it's not enough to join forces or to bring people together from across different sectors that believe in the same principles and values at the national level, then using also the transnational platforms and networks. And I think we have seen how change is achieved. Oftentimes, if the internal pressure is not enough, the transnational, regional, global pressure might put the topic on the agenda, bring more eyes to it, and I think that's how it can be achieved in whatever field it is. So obviously from the UN perspective, our role is in convening. We work with governments and civil society and other actors, private sector and so on. So our key role is in convening, bringing people together, creating the spaces, enabling dialogue and fostering that kind of exchange of views. So regarding supporting civil society, for UN Women, it's very important that we allow for them to be able to influence the decisions of the ones that are, the gatekeepers, if you want, the ones that adopt legislation, policies, the ones that have, adopt budgets and so on. So that is the key role we can play in the UN. And actually, to the question by Catherine on accessing funding for women living in rural areas, I don't have like concrete, specific answers, but I do believe that we have to do more in reminding states the obligations they have, and like Selena said, it's true that oftentimes we think that the support, the funding is outside only, and it is. I mean, it does exist outside. There are a lot of UN global funds. There is the Women Humanitarian Fund, for example. There is the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. So there are some of these global funds that can be accessed. But it's true that in order to access them, you have to be part of a formal organization, register as an NGO in the country. You have to fulfill a lot of, sometimes quite, cumbersome requirements. So it's not easy for everyone. It's not accessible for everyone, particularly if you're not organized formally or registered as an NGO in the country. But there are ways of accessing and also finding out who is accessing those funds and demand also from them that they support at the grassroots level. So I think that's another key maybe advice I can give, apart from obviously not forgetting that states have a key obligation. So the lobbying and advocacy with states, with governments is essential.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Victoria. There are many comments in the chat. One of them is from Jane Colvin. If you can please, Victoria, put in the links for the Feminine Plan for Sustainability and Social Justice, if you can do that. Let me just give the final word to Selena for any closing comments. There are some comments, Selena, in the chat. Thank you so much for your intervention, building on the resilience of women and their financial emancipation. From Georgia Papuzzi, I believe it is models. Let me just see if I can hold this there. I believe that it is also everyone's responsibility to choose the economic models that do care about and involve people, not in the expense of the planet. The cooperative model is an alternative to push for an economic system change on this front. So thank you for highlighting that. So Selena, let me give you the final word before I turn it back to Hudi, who will close the session.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to appreciate you, Rosa, for keeping us on our toes, bringing us together to discuss these issues. And I think we shouldn't give up. We shouldn't tire. We need to continue this conversation. So keep bringing us together at all times for us to be able to talk about these things. Just to let you know that the Global South, our problems are similar. They're very similar. They are no different. I've been to the Philippines. I've been to Indonesia, and looking at what is happening around land rights, around climate change, cutting the deforestation around mangroves. These things are happening in Africa, and I'm sure they're happening also in Latin America. So the countries of the Global South, I think we have a lot to borrow from each other, and we can share these experiences, through these kinds of platforms. This is what I'm encouraging us to continue doing and looking for solutions. We can have. It's not always one shoe fits all, but the problems are really quite similar. Now there is Glasgow. there is Glasgow and Rosa. I think we need to have maybe 1 or 2 more conversations before we get to Glasgow, because I think we need a strong message. We need to bring a strong message to our leaders in Glasgow around these issues. You know, the funding, the stringent funding processes for women to access this money, and where is this money, and what are our governments doing in the global south? That is the best place where we can find them and where we can talk together about these things. So I think let's strive to get 1 or 2 strong messages from our group that we can bring to Glasgow and talk to our governments. I appreciate this, and let us continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Selena. You point us in the right direction. And thank you to Victoria as well, and Mara and Lidi for this fantastic panel, really focusing our work leading up to the CSW 66. I want to thank you all and my co-organizer, Margarita Jones, for participating today and bringing these very strong messages. That last call, Selena, thank you so much for leading us in that. Thank you so much. We hope you really benefited from this panel, and I want to turn over now to Huri. Thank you so much, Huri.
Thank you, Rosa. And look at my background. I have the 50th anniversary too. Thank you all for being here. Rosa and Margarita, what a stellar, and our panelists, Victoria from UN Women, our old collaborator for years now, and every single name I'm seeing here. Just briefly, I put 2 links for funding. Ford Foundation actually specifically is doing great work with African Americans and for funding, and then Global Fund for Women. And I agree with Selena, the money is always there. I always say this and people look at me like, so then give it to us. Well, it is not up to me to provide money for everybody, obviously. But I do believe there is always money out there if you need it. If you have a good purpose and if you're doing the work, the actual work, money is there. You just have to go get it. I know, and I'm sorry if that sounds too full of myself, but just have that thought in your mind and have abundance and not scarcity. We are here to share whatever we have with you. The other thing I want to also advise you, just from my own personal experience, I am a businesswoman at heart. That was the first half of my life. Always think about self-sustainability. Do not count on others to help you. Depend on yourself and figure out ways of really generating your own money. Even in a nonprofit, there are so many different ways of doing this. I am not here to be a guru or a teacher of this. I'm just giving you my advice and my experience. So having said that, I just want to again thank everybody, and you know our rules. At the end of the meeting, everybody turns on their camera and their and microphones so that we can see and hear each other, energize each other. And please do take care of yourselves, self-care, hot teas, anything you need to do to get energized. And we have an amazing year ahead of us with Rosa and Pamela leading the way for our forum. Thank you all. Thank you to my team, Aziz, all of our old friends, Yvonne, Sheila, Devin in the office. All right, turn on your cameras and your microphones. Let me hear you. And then
hello, 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 hello.
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 Hello.